Okay. Um, in this session, we shall continue discussing about the external factors for the rise of mass nationalism in Africa. In the previous session, we had looked at what nationalism is, and we say it's that consciousness among the group of people that share common culture and a either common language to fight against the external forces. And in this particular case, it was about fighting against colonialism. And here we are looking at external factors for the rise of mass nationalism in the 1940s, that is after the Second World War. We had looked already at the interwar period where we had nationalism of its own character, in which it was more of parochial, and we saw how the characteristics of that kind of nationalism was not mass nationalism, but they were independent, small organizations that were organized in terms of either of whether they were peasants or they were workers, but they were kind of like separate. And they were demanding their demands were not to destroy colonialism or to dismantle colonialism or to carry out a revolution, but it was about their demands, the reforms that they wanted. And they wanted to be at equal footing with the colonial masters. And that kind of nationalism was not mass nationalism. So here we are seeing that nationalism that really led to independence of Africa. So one of the external factors that we had looked at was the effects of the World War. It broke out in 1939 to 1945, and we see clearly that the Second World War had impacted positively, because we say that when the Africans fought for independence, but they were actually influenced by this the Second World War. The effects of the Second World War was that the Africans that we are seeing, the African soldiers who fought alongside the European masters, discovered that even the white people, even the colonial masters, could actually be killed. So we had mentioned about the deflation, that it is the deflation of the white man's prestige, whereby the Africans had looked at as the colonial masters, as the white people, that as superior. But now they discovered that they are all human beings. There was no superior race. Okay. So that factor of still about the external factor, about the World War II, we are seeing that the ex-servicemen, the African ex-servicemen, when they returned from their countries at the end of the war, they were no longer ready to accept the colonial masters as their bosses. So they struggled to drive them out of their motherland. Okay, so yeah, of course, we mentioned also about the exposure. When they went there, they also discovered that they could talk with others and they could share some ideas. And also, American soldiers were there and they were explaining how they were able to fight the British and they acquired their independence. So it was the same thing. So that was about the war. Now, this other factor, we had not looked at it, the Atlantic Charter. So at the peak of the World War, in 1941, the Atlantic Charter was formed, and it provided for the principle of self-rule, self-determination of all people in the world. It was not specifically for particular countries. So the African nationalists also employed this kind of charter as an additional weapon to fight for independence, to demand for self-rule. So it definitely Churchill had to give in, and of course they had to liquidate the British Empire. And also during that time, there was also later on the formation of the United Nations. In United Nations in 1945, which endorsed actually the doctrine of self-determination, and it included it in its own charter, the UN Charter. So the African nationalists were getting stronger now, and they presented their demand, the argument that that doctrine of self-determination also applied to their countries. And so they had to demand for independence because of that. So they were encouraged with their struggle for independence after knowing that the UN body was for everybody, and it recognized their cause. And so they had to demand for independence. So in addition to that, the UN Assembly provided a forum through which representatives from the third world countries articulated their demands so that they could be granted independence. So we see here like a number of African leaders of the associations, they had to go and present their demands in the UN. And so also we are seeing another factor, an external factor during that time. After the Second World War, USA and USSR, both of them had emerged as superpowers. You know that Europe had fought, and so the economies went down a little bit. And so these other powers were now rising, but at the same time, we are seeing these other powers that were two major blocks, the capitalists and the socialists, and they were the superpowers. And they were emerging as superpowers, and they were demanding for independence of Africa. They were demanding for independence of the third world countries. We see Cold War, you see? So the two powers were opposite, and they had interest in African countries getting their independence because, of course, that one will also weaken the Western powers. So they opposed colonialism, and they had to put pressure on Britain, and they requested the British to grant independence to her colonies. So that external factor also added a strength. Okay, so still, that is still the continuation of the same. The USSR and USA, they had to put pressure on Churchill and told him that the British must liquidate their empire and grant independence to her colonies. We are also seeing the role of the British Labour Party. The British Labour Party, of course, was a socialist party, and as you know in the previous lectures, socialism was influenced by the ideas of Karl Marx, and these are against exploitation, against imperialism, and for that matter, the Labour Party's principles and the manifesto and all that thing, the Labour Party is against colonialism. So it was anti-colonialism, and so the Labour Party promptly translated its own program of the rejection and repudiation of colonialism to the official policy of the British. That is when when Churchill had lost power during elections. The Labour Party came into place, and so it had to advocate for independence of the colonies. So they had to enact the Development and Welfare Act for the colonies in 1948, and which actually accelerated the pace for constitutional reforms regarding the grant of self-rule in all the British colonies. And so that was really like a blessing in disguise for African countries that were under the British. We have another factor, which is also considered an external factor for the rise of mass nationalism in Africa in the 1940s, that is the granting independence of India. India had been the colony of the British, and in August 1947, they were granted independence. So now the African nationalists, they said, okay, if India was granted independence, why couldn't they also do the same for Africa? Why couldn't the British also do the same for Africa? So the independence of India was really also considered as an external factor for the rise of nationalism. So the African nationalists had realized that Indians had struggled for their independence, and in the end they achieved it. And so it happens that, okay, they say if the success was this kind of success also encouraged African nationalists to struggle for their independence, hoping that they could also be granted. Okay. Yeah, still that is about the representatives that were sent to Nairobi, and his appointment was had contributed to the growth of African nationalism. So these were lessons that Africans also learned about. Okay. Another factor for the external factor for the rise of nationalism is the Pan-African movement. Pan-Africanism is the idea that people of African descent have common interests and should be unified. And Pan-Africanism is the sentiment that people of African descent have have some great deal in common. And now this Pan-African movement uh, dealt away with that misconception that African unity is not possible because they don't have a common race or culture or language that unifies them. So it means that Africans, wherever they are, they can still unite. Because when you look at this Pan-Africanism, it was actually not formed within the African continent. It was started by the people of African origin that were like Marcus Garvey, not Marcus Garvey. It was it was Du Bois who was actually had formulated this idea, and Africans were also, motivated by this kind of thing, to the extent that even in those meetings, I think the last meeting in the meeting in Manchester, some Africans had to attend. The African leaders, those who were leading independence struggle, had to attend the last meeting. But the previous meetings that took place, basically it was those Africans in the diaspora, and we can also say the Africans in the Caribbean, those of African descent, okay? The Marcus Garvey and others. So when you look at this kind of spirit of fighting against racism or fighting for independence during that time, it also actually affected, it had an impact on African leaders that were fighting for independence at that particular time. So that Manchester Congress was attended by over 200 delegates, yeah, on African, they were African elites. So they kind of like took up responsibility, yeah, and say, okay, we can also do it if these other Africans, of people of African descent are doing it, then we can also do it. So they demanded for constitutional changes and for universal adult suffrage. People they used not to have the rights to vote. But now here we see Africans are awakened by the Pan-African movement. So that was also one of the external factors. It played a very key role. Marcus Garvey and Du Bois, Du Bois, that is the founder of African nationalism, long before when we Africans were not conscious about our own degradation, these men fought for African national and racial equality. So that was a very good spirit that he actually had influenced African countries. So that movement demanded for the end of racial discrimination, stopping economic exploitation of Africa, and above all, they demanded for independence for colonized African states. So that movement also gave encouragement to the African nationalists like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Julius Nyerere, and others, that they had to fight for their independence because they have that support. So having looked at those external factors for the rise of nationalism, let us now shift to the internal factors for the rise of nationalism. One of the very first factors was the rise of educated class. Almost all the modern African national leaders, the Nyerere, especially Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah, and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, they had actually gone abroad for studies. So these young African leaders, when they spent their formative years in Europe, in America, and America for further studies, that alien environment had actually strengthened the feeling of national consciousness. Before that, they were engulfed with this idea of just ethnicity. Maybe someone is a Kikuyu or someone is, you have a particular tribe and that is that. But again, when they went out there, they were able to identify themselves. They had a common problem of fighting colonialism. So it is strengthened that feeling of national consciousness among themselves. And those are their fathers, the grandfathers, who may their soul rest in peace. But they really fought for Africa. Emergence of political parties is also one of them. Unlike those old associations that we saw in the interwar period, these parties were the mass parties. Like, for example, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroonians, the Convention for in Ghana, that is Gold Coast, there was Conventional People's Party. You know? Those are some of the parties that were there in West Africa. In Kenya, there was KANU, Tanganyika, there was TANU. In Uganda, there was a UNC, Uganda National Congress. So all those parties actually were mass parties. They were not like those small civil society organizations that used to be fighting for the reforms. These were demanding for real independence. The role of mass media. There used to be newspapers like the Morning Post and a number of newspapers that in African countries that they really fueled the fire for nationalism. Okay, so these newspapers, of course, they help to spread the news, to awaken Africans that they need to fight for independence. Yeah, there are also, yeah, the articles still is a part of it. Dr. Nandi Azikiwe was in charge of the sedition, and the medium eloquently demonstrated the pivotal role played by the press. So the role of the press has also to be recognized as one of the internal factors, because people would not know about fighting for independence if they were not reading, or if they were not listening to news. We also have the economic factor. Colonialism encouraged the transformation of Africa from subsistence into a monetary-based economy. And so this change all led to the introduction of currency, and which was cautiously encouraged by the colonial government to increase export and primary produce. So it created one of the first economic sources of problems also to colonial rule, because, that is like some sort of empowerment to Africans. The cash nexus linked the colonial territories to the mother countries in many ways. So this kind of monetary introduction, use of money, led to the growth of wage labor force and resulted to considerable proletarialization. The proletarians, the workers, had to demand for their freedom. So which means like we can say that colonialism, it was like more of self-destructing. I mean, self-destroying itself. So we are seeing also that the colonial rule contributed to the rise of the middle class, for that matter, and around urban centers, the rise of middle class, what it means is that they had to champion the influence and the spread of nationalistic sentiments. So that is also part of the internal factors. And the thirdly, urbanization, okay, that went along with the phenomenon of social mobility. So the new immigrants into city felt that they could demand on the colonial government for better services, better schools, better hospitals, and better life. So that urbanization is also considered as an internal factor. There are other sociological factors. It was the Western education, So that Western education provided a common language for the British of course, English. For the French colonies, they are using French. So that kind of thing also, we can consider it from a positive point of view, that language provided a very common factor so that people could be united to fight the colonial masters. Because originally, of course, language was intended to help service colonial rule. A common language was so now, but again, it was used positively by the Africans to demand for independence or to unite them. So maybe another thing which we might ask ourselves is that decolonization, about decolonization process in Africa, one of the questions we could ask ourselves is what um, what determined a given course of action opened to the colonial people? In an attempt to answer that kind of question, we have to mind about some of the things. For example, it depended on the presence of the settlers. The countries that were having settler economy and with the presence of the colonialists in the continent, it took them long and to get rid of colonial rule. Or it also took sometimes armed struggle. It was different from the countries where we had, for example, indirect rule by the British. Negotiations were going to be possible. But when it comes to countries that white settlers, there was high resistance to nationalist struggle, okay? Because they had already established themselves, like in Rhodesia, in Kenya, in Algeria, there was high resistance to nationalist struggle. But in colonies such as Nigeria, Tanganyika, Ghana, Gambia, the opposition to nationalism was sort of less militant. So the response depended on the type of administration of the colonialists. Okay. In the former categories, for like when you look at Algeria, the France had to face humiliation of defeat in a war of liberation that was waged by the armed nationalists. So that is what happened. So I think it depends on the powers that were there. In case of the Portuguese colonies, Portugal was the first colonial master to come to Africa and the last to leave. You see Angola getting independence in 1975. Also Mozambique also. So you see the presence of settlers also mattered, okay? In some settler colonies, there was option for unilateral declaration of independence, in the sense that in some of those, like the French, former French colonies, so there's a way the Africans were like assimilated, and some of their leaders also were ready to be absorbed, to be just part of the system. They were mired. So the idea was to accord dominion status to white settlers while the blacks remained under minority rule. The example of Rhodesia. They had the Declaration of Independence in 1965. But because of the sanctions, Ian Smith could not sustain for a long time that illegal kind of declaration of independence. And you see later on Zimbabwe getting its independence in 1980. So that is what happened. So there are differences in the pace of nationalism between the British and the French colonies, depending on the presence of the white settlers or the absence of the white settlers. For example, we are seeing here the British policy of indirect rule. It created a division between the traditional rulers and educated elites. This is sort of a divide and rule. So because the educated Africans were excluded from the colonial administration, they tended to think or to see the traditional rulers as agents of colonial rule. We are seeing, for example, for the case of Uganda here, we are seeing about Semeka Kunguru and others who were more or less British kind of puppets. So in order to moderate that kind of opposition among the Africans, the British deliberately introduced constitutional reforms to accommodate the educated elites, which in turn speeded their agitation for the rightful, full control of their affairs. So that is what happened. On the other hand, the French policy of direct rule consciously made Africans, French educated elites, members of the French parliament, you see, to kind of like quell sort of resistance. And even so, the Africans found themselves swallowed in. The idea was to give them a false sense that they were part of the administration of the colonies so that they can keep quiet. It's like someone, you are making noise and then someone decides to put bread in your mouth. And of course, you just have to keep eating that bread. You will not have to say something about it. And yet, you want to fight for your people. So, like Bogny, the president of Ivory Coast at that time, he, in the response to clamor for independence, said there are no separatist seats. You know, they were talking about the future of French colonies, and he wasn't ready to fight for the right thing. So that is a very big challenge. So from in their words of some of these African leaders, coming from these leading African people, they were confirmation. Yeah, it was a confirmation that the French policy of assimilation, which was aimed at producing an elite that was a success in their colonies in Africa. So that is what the French, I think they were trying to achieve what they wanted. We are seeing political forces unlike France, Britain did not discourage her colonies from forming political parties. For example, the number of parties were formed, as we are aware, as we had seen previously in the previous slides. Okay. Yeah, there were also restrictions of Western education in French in French colonies. So, in summary, while British consciously and gradually worked colonies towards independence, France had to a greater extent. Portugal also saw the colonies as extensions of their metropolitan mother countries. So that's why the people in the French colonies, they were seeing that they are part of France. Okay, so that is the challenging of settler kind of colonies. In the next slides, in the next sessions, we shall be able also to look at decolonization process in Africa, especially focusing on the impact of nationalism on African decolonization process. Okay, so I think that is what we shall look at in the coming sessions.